And joining us now to talk about this is our aptly named Truth in Politics panel with Niigaan, Sinclair, and Kerry, Benjoe. Thank you, Niigaan and Kerry, for joining us today. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Peoples, Jose Francisco Cali-Zay, has been touring Canada. He held a press conference in Ottawa and made some comments about residential schools, the child welfare system, and murdered and missing women and girls. He called on Canada to make a lot of changes in those areas. So you first this time, Niigaan. What stands out for you in this rapporteur's list?
Well, I think the most remarkable thing is the tone. I mean, the last time that we saw a UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Rights come to Canada was 2013. James Anaya was condemnatory of then government Stephen Harper and used words like crisis, used words like emergency, used words like neglect. And this report is arguably probably the most rosiest report you'd seen from this office since UN Special Rapporteurs on Indigenous rights have been coming to the country. This is the third visit, and so it's probably the visit that's been the least covered by media, because there's been such a cacophony of coverage of Indigenous issues within the media. In fact, there's just a number of things that are even happening today. But parts of the statement are really important. One really important part is the highlighting of residential schools, the unmarked graves, and then the call on the government to act more on the calls for justice for the murder, missing Indigenous women and girls inquiry. It's certainly evidence. These kinds of visits are all about who he saw. And as he mentions, he spent most of his time in Quebec, Manitoba, and British Columbia. Interestingly, Alberta rejected his request for a visit, the government of Alberta. I mean, that's notable, and I think that says a lot about where Alberta's at in terms of so-called reconciliation. And then, of course, all the other things that he's drawing upon, which is a lot of historical issues, or even goes insofar as to talk about the Indian Act and the lack of economic progress and so on. I mean, this is pretty much what we expected, but it is certainly a more positive report than previous UN Special Rapporteurs have given.
And what are the chances of Canada answering these calls?
Well, I mean, the challenge with any of these calls, even the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, is it's not about having, checking a box and finishing a call to action. I think a lot of people want to say, okay, how many calls to action are completed? Most of the calls for justice are almost impossible to complete because they refer to relationships, and they refer to an ongoing, for example, training for RCMP or a further extension of relationships between the RCMP and then provincial police forces, civic police forces. And so we see small instances of success, but certainly not dealing with the issue. We only have to look right here where I am on Treaty 1 to see that Indigenous women continue to be targeted, continue to be neglected. Police, the chief of police saying that it's not feasible to look for them in landfill sites. And then, of course, the ongoing issue, you only have to see that the over-policing, the over-incarceration, the situation of violence with Indigenous women. Just this past week on a First Nation in northern Manitoba, a woman was murdered. So, I mean, the situation continues to be dire, and I think Canada is not taking this issue seriously, as pointed out in the report.
And same question to you, Kerry. What stands out for you from the Rapporteur's report?
Niigaan covered a lot of what I was going to touch on, and I think it's really important to see the progress. Even though a lot of the issues are still being addressed, there is a small measure of progress. And it's really important that these issues stay in the forefront, the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've had tons of reports, but obviously none of these things have been adequately addressed, since we're still talking about these things and we still have people visiting and seeing and identifying these as real issues. The over-incarceration of Indigenous women, missing and murdered Indigenous women, everything that goes on in that realm. As a working reporter still, my mailbox is flooded with missing and murdered Indigenous women, which is a big difference from years ago when it would only be families like saying, okay, somebody's missing, or not even hearing anything until a body was discovered. There there has been some measures of progress, but we're still a long way from being equal.
In northwestern Ontario, the 49 chiefs of the Anishinaabe-Aski Nation are trying to sanction or suspend their Grand Chief Derek Fox for allegedly harassing staff members. He's refusing to step down. In December, he was publicly accused of being an abuser of women in the presence of a few hundred chiefs on the floor of the Assembly of First Nations in Ottawa. Niigaan First Nation Chief Jeffrey Kopanes made the accusation, and Chief Fox has filed a defamation lawsuit against Chief Kopanes. Kerry, what are the implications of this type of action by a group of chiefs against someone they elected to represent them?
I think it's a long time coming. I think generally the atmosphere now, as more Indigenous women are taking up space in areas of politics, we're going to see more action in terms of holding our leaders accountable for things that they feel are not becoming of a leader. I'm not going to speak directly about this case, but in general terms, I think we're starting to see a change in the power structure. Women's issues, women's concerns, and women voices are starting to make their way to the table. We have allies, male allies, chiefs coming forward and speaking on behalf of women and trying to hold their counterparts accountable for actions that they want them to address. And I think that's really important that we do have these conversations. Just looking at what is happening in the U.S. with American actor Nathan Chasing Horse, and how he was, just able to continue living this life for decades without anyone holding him accountable. And it wasn't until the women, they took it further and wanted support that something was done in terms of holding them accountable. I think that as we move forward, we're going to see more people, more actions like this taken. I disagree with it being played out in public. I think now comes the time when we need to start to have maybe a sort of public complaints thing that happens. They have it in the police departments where people can register a complaint, it's investigated, and that takes place there. As a reporter, it gets tiring always writing about the bad chief, because it creates this false narrative that all Indigenous people, all Indigenous leaders are bad people. And so I'm sort of in the midst of it. We need to hold our leaders accountable, but we don't need to make a public spectacle of it, because it kind of takes away from the job of leaders. So I'm kind of in the middle of everything.
Thanks, Kerry. Well, we'll have to leave it there, but thank you so much, Niigaan and Kerry, for joining us today to talk a little bit more about these topics.
Yeah, MMIWG, thanks.